Hey guys, so I've recently started on a new labor of love, going through all the different legendary lords and putting together a list of what would be my choices for the best mods to amplify the good of that campaign and mitigate the bad. We'll be talking about mods that affect everything from the battlefield to the campaign map, skill trees, technologies, new units, and mechanics, including the must-haves for every campaign along with faction-specific options. I've been diligently scouring the workshop for the best mods and testing different combinations to make sure they work together to bring all of you lovely people the best Warhammer 3 campaigns possible. I'm starting with some of my favorite legendary lords, or at least the ones I have the most experience with, but I hope to eventually get through all of them. As always, if you have suggestions on which ones you think I should prioritize, please let me know in the comments. Most mods will be optional, depending on your own preferences and circumstances, but in the rare cases that mods are dependent on one another, I will include that in this discussion. There is one necessary disclaimer, of course. There's a limit to how much one person can test, to say nothing about how mods can be changed or fall out of support, or CA can drop a new patch that breaks things. So it's especially useful to give and get feedback if you've found any issues with any of these mods, either in the comments section of this video or coming soon on a Discord server that a few of us are in the process of setting up. More on that soon. So let's get into the first on our list. My longtime favorite legendary lord, the guy that everyone liked to complain about when Warhammer 3 first launched, then had the scales fall from their heretical eyes after Thrones of Decay came out. I'm talking, of course, about Kugath Plaguefather of the Nurgle faction. Now, when we talk about Kugath, or Nurgle in general for that matter, we're talking about slow but inevitable creeping corruption and disease taking over the world, starting on the fringes of civilization and perhaps being easy for the naive races to ignore as only some distant, remote threat. But in time, that threat inexorably grows like a slow, unstoppable force. The Nurgle roster tends to be slow but extremely sturdy, and the playstyle favors those who enjoy defensive tactics and methodical expansion. Of the different Nurgle legendary lords, Kugath leans towards the demonic half of the roster, with a personal focus on lowly Nurglings, which can be turned into surprisingly tough nasties that last well into the mid-game, and then to a lesser extent on great unclean ones, but is by no means limited to them and can do just fine employing a mix of demons and mortals. Moreover, the revamped plague mechanic allows Nurgle to address any shortcomings of the armies. Want to engage the enemy quickly but only have slow units? You can give your entire army vanguard deployment with a single plague symptom. Find your treasury dropping into the red? More symptoms provide significant boosts to your settlement income or significantly reduce the upkeep costs of your units. There are tons and tons of options here in a mechanic that is nice and thematic, well designed, and incredibly functional. If you like a fast-paced campaign with rapid expansion, or happen to worship Tzeentch, this is not going to be a campaign that appeals to you. But if you can see the innate beauty of toad dragons and all manner of beasties covered in ginormous mouths and pustulent tentacles, then you'll love this campaign. So here are my recommendations for the best Kugath campaign, starting with the foundational mods that I suggest using for most, but not all campaigns, and have covered extensively in other videos. I'll have a link to all these in the description section of this video, and if these videos do well enough, I'll make a mod collection on Steam so that you can get all the mods on this list with one click. I'm labeling the first three as Tier 1 staples. These are the big three that function as the backbone for pretty much all the videos I've made talking about proper grand strategy. So here they are, Tier 1 staples. Minus 50% campaign army movement, AI plus player. As I've started going through all these different campaigns, I realized that this mod is not ideally suited to all of them. For example, the next one in this series is a legendary lord I'm not going to recommend using this with. I won't say who yet, but I'll give a hint. He's red. But anyway, this is perfect for Kugath because it leans into that slow but unstoppable theme. War of Attrition, reduced replenishment. By the way, there's another mod that behaves very similar to this one. This is just the one that I know has been updated recently. It's maintained by Serb, who has done a lot of other mods that I use in my playthroughs, and I know that he stays on top of things. So anyway, War of Attrition, reduced replenishment is another staple. That's a must-have for every campaign. But in the case of Nurgle, it really makes some of your faction-specific boosts, like Plagues, even more powerful to give you a strategic advantage over your enemies. And finally, Chose improved garrisons. You could swap this with a different garrison mod if you prefer another one. There are certainly plenty of them out there on the workshop. I like Chose because it fixes the problem of garrison spellcasters without spells. All right, this next section are what I'm calling the Tier 2 staples. All of these I go into more detail in other videos, so for the sake of brevity, all I'll say here about most of them is that I think they do add value to a Kugath campaign. I will show examples for a few of them that you may be less familiar with or that are less intuitive. Victory Conditions Overhaul. I'll quickly show an example here of what this does in-game. So if you go under your victory conditions here, you can see that there are multiple routes to it. I'll go through the first two of them here. Each one gives you a different reward for accomplishing different things. So here we've got the Great Game, spreading corruption over 50 regions. And if you also need to attain at least 2,000 infections. And as you can see here, you get, amongst other things, increased capacity for your cultists. And then the second route here, this is Eastern Poxes. This is destroying Helmengorst, and I think that's Western provinces in regular vanilla. Keep in mind here that I'm using a different faction name because I use the Evolving Faction Names mod. And then, of course, you've got the Lizardmen down here as well. That is, I want to say, is it Krokgar? Yeah, I think that's Krokgar down there. And then you have raise or conquer the appropriate capitals of those particular factions. And then what you get out of that is a couple of just benefits to your infections and your weapon strength and your growth and missile resistance when fighting against Cathay, for example. So not overpowered by any stretch of the imagination, but certainly quite useful. So you get the idea here. Victory Conditions Overhaul is just basically a thematic take on the way that vanilla handles victory conditions. Next one is Wounded Leaders Matter, combined with Longer Lord Wound Timer of 10 turns. Again, pretty self-explanatory, and I've talked about this one before, so I'm not going to go into detail here. The next one is Slower Expansion and Settlement Supply Lines, Slow Start version. This is one that I've done an entire video about, but I'll go ahead and show just very briefly here an example of what it does. Every time you take a new settlement, you have a few turns of, let's call it, disruption as people immigrate from one settlement to another, resources have to flow from one to another. It affects things like your public order and your growth, to a certain extent also your replenishment rate. And so basically what it does is it forces expansion to slow down to avoid the steamrolling that happens in vanilla, and it does it in a very thematic way. Again, check out that other video if you have any more specific questions or want to know more about this particular mod. It's one of my favorites. I highly recommend it. Then we have Scaling AI, which is another one I've talked about in another video. It basically, rather than giving the AI flat buffs from the beginning of the game and then all game long, this is a way to sort of overcome the fact that the early part of the game is really the only challenging part of it in most cases. And the way that it handles that is it starts out with rather reduced cheats for the AI at the beginning of your campaign, but they incrementally go up the longer the campaign goes on. So it's a way to make the early game a little bit less challenging and the mid and late games more and more challenging. Next one is Research Rate minus 50%. This is a new one that one of you created for me. Well, okay, not just for me, but you created it based on a previous video that I made. I like this because I think it helps match up with the with the reduced rate of the overall pacing of the game. So if you're slowing down movement, if you're slowing down expansion, if you're slowing down what's coming up next, which is a slower experience for your characters, I think it makes sense to also reduce your research rate. And the aforementioned slower experience by 25% mod. I feel like this is a pretty good balance where you still can very much appreciate every time your characters level up. And again, it helps fit the pacing of the overall slower campaign. Okay, another one I'm going to show an example of here is Cho's improved faction and legendary lord flavor. You can see here right on the menu screen, this is what this mod does in terms of Kugath, his campaign, both his faction effects and his legendary lord effects. Next one, which I really like, and obviously this is quite optional, is Morangi's land encounter mod. Here's an example of a land encounter popping up in the campaign. It's nothing but a on-land version of what already happens in vanilla Warhammer with the sea encounters. It is just ever so slightly different because you do get a message to let you know that they have popped up in one of your regions. And then also when you do move into that location, like I do here a little bit later on in this campaign, it does show you the exact composition of the army that you're going to be going up against. I don't really know. I guess I have mixed feelings about that. I would probably prefer to not be able to see exactly what the enemy army composition is going to be, just like how it is handled with the sea battles, but I don't feel super strongly about it. Next one up is tougher siege tweaks. Again, I've done a full video on why I think sieges need a lot of work, and this is one of the core mods that does improve the vanilla siege battle experience. I know some of you feel like there's nothing that can be done to improve the siege battle experience. I happen to disagree with that. I think you can actually make these siege battles quite interesting. In fact, they've turned into some of my favorite experiences in this game, but obviously your mileage may vary. And then finally, we have no real-time building reborn, which is the same, it goes hand in hand with what I just talked about with siege battles not being very good. This just turns off that real-time, sort of that tower building mini game that happens in settlement battles, which is extremely, for the most part, unrealistic. And quite frankly, I find it more of a nuisance. I find it more immersion breaking than actual fun. So what this does is it just increases your capacity to build them up front, and then you can, but you can no longer build them once the battle begins. All right, so that's enough of our foundation type mods. Now let's get into the more Kugath specific mods. So you have two choices here. Either a sort of one-size-fits-all mod specific to Nurgle, or a combination of three mods that work together. My recommendation is the first one, and that's Nurgle Plus. So this one is worth taking a couple of minutes to talk about. As you can see here, its features are: it provides better Nurgle traits. It uses the examples here of Scabrous and Infectious, but others are affected as well. Unique skill nodes for Great Unclean One of Nurgle, and another one for the variant Death, and a modification for the Demon Prince of Nurgle. Rebalanced recruitment and upkeep costs for units, better ancillaries, including Plague Doctor, Nurgle Mutant, etc., etc., improved cults buildings, new effects on 3 building chains when growth reach 200 or have 5 population. Let me go ahead and show you an example of that in the game. Unholy manifestations are greatly improved. Now you can find them worthy to be used. Don't miss their boons. And indeed, here's some examples of those. So this is one option, and I like it because it really does some quite thematic and intriguing things that are specifically tailored to people like me who love playing as Nurgle. But you have a different option as well. One thing that's missing from Nurgle Plus is additional units, and that's why I'm including an alternative group of 3 mods that work together to do some of the same things, plus some additions, including allowing for more units. Note that I do not recommend using any of these at the same time as Nurgle Plus because they either overlap the same tables or could cause balancing issues. That's why I'm suggesting these as a wholly separate alternative option. The first one of these is Nurgle Tech Tree, and as you can see here, here is an example. It really adds quite a lot to the Nurgle Tech Tree. As you can read in the description, the mod adds over 50 new technologies to the vanilla tech tree. Completely new effects have been added that do not exist in the vanilla tree. All units, heroes, and commanders have their technology to increase their stats. Further, effects like anti-infantry for Nurglings or anti-large for plague bearers are added as just an example of many. There are a couple of technologies that are available more often 2 to 3 times. For example, reduce recruitment costs, reduce construction costs, and reduce maintenance. Everything is small in number that together provide a good bonus but not too overpowered. The next one is expanded heroes skill trees for Nurgle and Warriors of Chaos. I'm showing here an example of what a expanded hero skill tree looks like for a plague-ridden. Note that both the Nurgle and Warriors of Chaos skill trees are included in the mod author's full compilation, so you could just use that if you prefer. And then finally, for units, I recommend Singe's units. Because Kugath has an emphasis on the demonic part of the roster, Singe's units wins out over other unit mod options that add more mortal units. I will be recommending those in the Tamarcon video when I get to that. And here in the background, you can see what some of these lovely variants look like in battle. And finally, there's one last option that I don't recommend for most campaigns, but I will for Kugath and possibly a few others. It's a complex topic that probably deserves its own discussion, but here I will summarize by saying that I think the default climate setup in vanilla actually works pretty well. But in the case of Kugath, his most likely path of expansion immediately takes him into provinces with unsuitable climates, which can be a bit of an annoyance. So this is one of the cases where I would use the Torture Climate Building Changes Climates mod. And here's what it looks like in campaign. It's basically taking your torch looking, or actually it's called the protection building chain here. And what it does is it takes your uninhabitable and unpleasant climates and turns them into surmounted climates. Like I said, fully optional. Nurgle is one of the factions that does actually have a reason to build this particular building chain, even if this functionality wasn't added to it. So this is probably what you would think of as a straight up boost for the faction. Again, fully optional, take it or leave it as you prefer. And there we have it. Those are basically the distilled version of all the different mods that I tested that I think add the most value to a Nurgle campaign. This was entirely focused on functional mods. There's any number of cosmetic mods that I use, but since those are completely subjective, I didn't really get into those. You could very easily go down a rabbit hole trying to find all of the best cosmetic mobs. But hopefully this has been useful to some of you. Again, links to all of these mods are in the description below. Also, please let me know if you have found other mods that provide some additional value to a Nurgle campaign. I have no doubt that there's plenty. These are just the ones that I felt like added the best bang for the buck, so to speak. But again, I'd be very interested in hearing what the rest of you think. Also, let me know if you think videos like this are at all interesting or helpful. Like I said, I've been enjoying going back through campaigns and trying to figure out what are the best mods for each legendary lord. But maybe that's just me. There may not be that many people who would be interested in a series of videos like that. And if that is the case, whether you think that would be good or not, please let me know in the comments. As always, ask any questions or give any other suggestions that you can think of down there. I certainly appreciate it. I guess with that, I'll go ahead and leave it there. Thanks everybody so much for watching and listening, and I will see you all in the next video.